January 30th. It was a Thursday. I was mentoring at Ruth Hill with a little guy that I eat lunch with every week. It was just a normal Thursday. I had lunch with a friend after I wrapped up mentoring. Had a management team meeting that afternoon. Finished up with some message prep for that coming Sunday. At the same time, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of the coronavirus a public health emergency of international concern. I didn't pay any attention to it. I just went about the rest of my Thursday evening like any other Thursday evening. On Thursday evening, I have to take the trash to the road. That's what I did. I've got an alarm that goes off on my phone. It says 8 o'clock. Take the trash to the street. I didn't pay any attention to the World Health Organization. January 31st was an off day. It was a Friday. My family that evening went to the movie theater. We saw Star Wars: Rise of Skywalker. How about that? It was good. I thought it was a great movie. It was good. The same day, Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency for the United States. And again, I didn't pay much attention to it, January 31st. March 11th, we fast forward a little bit. Again, a normal work day. Brooke and I hosted in our home night one of our foundation group, which was to kick off for the next 10 to 12 weeks. And so we had everybody over to the house, and we did a fire outside, had a little party, and we ate and just talked. And it was just the first time our foundation group had gotten together, and that's kind of where we were, March 11th. And at the same time, the very same time, the World Health Organization characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic. And again, I didn't pay any attention to it. I heard about it, read about it, but I felt like, I've seen these news reports before, I'd seen it with other outbreaks. I'd seen those things, and it wasn't something that was registering with me. March 13th, I saw a friend in the hospital. I met with some local nonprofits, and that very day, the President of the United States declared the COVID-19 outbreak a national emergency. Then I started to pay a little bit of attention. March 21st was supposed to be opening day for Little League Baseball. I coach my son Emerson's 8 and under Little League team. We were supposed to do pictures yesterday morning. We were supposed to maybe get our tails kicked in the very first day of spring baseball. He's been working on his footwork at shortstop. Instead, we sat at home yesterday. We sat at home and we had the first death in Coweta County from COVID-19. I don't know the person's name. It wasn't listed in the paper last evening. If your family is watching, though, we're so sorry. We're so sorry. This has kind of gotten away from us a little bit. It's kind of jumped up and bit us, wouldn't you say? Officially, it's named SARS-CoV-2. The disease that SARS-CoV-2 causes is called the coronavirus disease 2019, which is where then we get the abbreviated version COVID-19. And here in the midst of this, we're waiting. We're concerned, we're worried, we're anxious. We see other states do lockdowns completely, where we already have some restrictions and suggestions for what ought to be happening here. It's kind of wreaking havoc on local businesses and all those things. It's causing hourly employees to lose their jobs. There's a lot of uncertainty happening in the world, and we're sitting here waiting for what's happening. which then puts our team, our leadership team here at the church in a place where we have to say, what does God have to say about it? If our faith says that God was before us, if our faith says that God was in this day long before we ever got here, that he saw it was coming, then surely he has some wisdom for us to gain from where we find our wisdom in the Bible. In the first century, there was a guy by the name of Paul. Paul was a church planter. Paul went around all over in multiple journeys, planting churches just all over the place. And so Paul has a church in the city of Corinth. And he's written them once, he's visited, and they're having some issues. And maybe you hear a few similarities with just how we're kind of feeling as a country right now. There were people that were in the city that were spreading doubt, some misinformation, some rumors, and some just outright lies were actually happening inside of this church community. And that doubt was causing people to question what they were about and what they stood for, those kind of things. The church itself was losing its identity. It was starting to change. In fact, there were questions, could a church even survive in this new form of doubt that was being spread? Their priorities were completely out of order, and so they were trying to figure out what are the things that should gather and gain our attention. People were timid. People were scared. They weren't sure what to do. And then Paul responds with a letter that we see today in our Bible as the letter called 2 Corinthians. It's one of the most personal letters in the entirety of the Bible. The church planter Paul pours his heart out to a group of people he dearly loves. In the midst of a lot of confusion and chaos and doubt and uncertainty. And I think it's here in the letter that we call 2 Corinthians that we can find some wisdom for today. And so what I want you to do as you're listening at home, as you're kind of hanging out here in the studio, right? I just want us, as we read it together, for you just to kind of put yourself in the audience and say, hey, if the church planter Paul could talk to me, I just want to hear his words come across as they're talking directly to you, you know? So just, I don't know what you think the church planter Paul looks like. I'm not really sure. To me, he kind of looks like Gandalf. I'm not sure. That's just the very first thing I'm thinking of. But that's what I'm thinking. I don't think that's probably accurate, but that's just what I'm seeing in my mind. So I'm going to see Gandalf in my mind as I read this, talking to me. You do you out there in Facebook land and YouTube land. You can probably put whoever you think he looks like in the chat, and then y'all will probably get a kick out of that. Here we go. Talking to you, 2 Corinthians 4, 5 through 12. The church planter Paul says this: For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of the darkness, made his light shine in our hearts, to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. So there's a few things that I want to point out, a few things that I want to kind of walk through. As you hear Paul actually say that to you, there's a few key phrases in that passage. We'll leave it on the screen that I want to make sure we point out. The first one is this: what we preach is not ourselves. So if you're a follower of Jesus, I'm not just strictly talking about, hey, Paul talking to you, or Paul says, hey, what I preach is not ourselves. But if we're followers of Jesus and we have a message for the world, Paul has a message for you, you turn around and give that message to the world. What we're saying is, hey, what we're going to declare in the midst of this shaking of our world, in the midst of all these things, what we're going to declare in the midst of this is simply that what we have to say, what's put into our heart is not from us. Now, isn't that a relief? I mean, isn't that a relief that the pressure is not on us for us to interact in a way where we're like, we have to come up with this content that's going to like save the world from their doubts? That we don't have to come up with this message of hope, that we don't have to come up with this idea of exactly where we're coming from in times of trouble, or in times of doubt, in times of frustration, times of fear. Like, that doesn't rest on us. We're just saying what we have doesn't come from ourselves, but we are going to communicate it to you. And he says, he frames it even beyond that. He says, what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants. Man, In other words, he said, hey, the pressure is not on me to come up with the message that I ought to give my world. The pressure is not on me to find hope for the world. The pressure is not on me to manufacture some steadiness in the shaking of the world. That's not on me. In fact, it's going to come from Jesus specifically. But on top of that, beyond all of those things, my posture, the only thing I am responsible for is that as I deliver this message that didn't come from me, but comes from Jesus, is for me to be in a posture of serving. That's it. That's it. As your servants, the mindset, regardless of our circumstances, must stay constant. That we're simply serving. I guess the question becomes, should following Jesus take a time out because the economy is bad? Should following Jesus take a time out because we probably should stay home a lot more than maybe some of us are? Should following Jesus just kind of take a break for a moment as we just kind of settle in and see what's next? Yeah, it can. It can take a time out. It can take a time out. But that's not a really great question, can it? The question really ought to be, should it? Should it take a time out? And then in all these things, he says, hey, you don't have to come up with the hope. You don't have to be the person that finds that. You don't have to be the person that creates all of those things. None of that. What you do have to make sure you can figure out, what you do have to make sure that there's an idea kind of coming from, is that you're in touch with Jesus, you have a message to give, and from that message, you have this serving posture, and then he tells you why. He says, for God made his light shine in our hearts. Because God made his light shine in our hearts. Did you notice what was happening there? If you're a follower of Jesus and have been for a long time, you might recognize that language. The church planter Paul is kind of hearkening back to creation language where he says, and God said, let there be light. And so God is saying in the midst of this world's shaking, he said, hey, and God said, let there be light that shines in our hearts. He said, hey, I'm giving you everything you need. You don't have to create the content of hope. You just need to make sure you're in a posture to serve. And I'm not only just going to gift you the content, I'm going to set it on fire inside of you. He said, I'm going to speak to you, speak to your heart, the way I spoke to light in the very beginning. And out of nothing came light. He continues in 2 Corinthians 4. He says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. And so he's still kind of working here. He's kind of working on this idea of, just in case you weren't clear that the hope doesn't come from us, just in case you weren't clear that you don't have to manufacture this, Paul gives us a reminder. He says, hey, let me give you this reminder. In fact, we have this treasure, this hope that God has given us, and we simply contain it in jars of clay. Where God says, hey, I put light in your heart, where I put the power of creation inside of you, where I took that light that I said in the beginning, I'm going to set it ablaze inside of your heart. Just a reminder, the vessel that holds that, our bodies, who we are, we're just simply jars of clay, very plain people. Compared to the glory of God, we are just simple jars of clay. But this is the cool thing. Because we are so simple, it elevates the message that comes from our simple selves. So when we have real, legitimate hope, when we have the ability to stand up in the midst of fear and in the midst of shaking, when we have the ability to stand strong and feel like, hey, the world can be shaking around us, but we will stand firm. When people begin to take notice of followers of Jesus and the way they respond in crisis, they begin to say, that can't be from them because they are fairly simple people. They're just like me. But then it points to a greater person. It points to a greater God that says, hey, maybe there is something to this Christian God. Maybe there is something to it because there's no other explanation. They are just simple jars of clay. Where is this supernatural thing coming from? Where is this ability to stand firm in the midst of shaking coming from? You know, I think I see this most in the friends that we have that are working in hospitals and the quick care places. what are those places called that you can go? Urgent care. There you go. Urgent care. Quick care. That's right. I think the people that are showing up there every day, I think there has to be something supernatural about it. This call for humanity to serve. First responders that take calls and walk into people's houses with no context except for what was given on a phone call. I just want to do something kind of special now. If you know someone that's working at a hospital or that's working at an urgent care or in the health care that's showing up to work every day, still receiving patients, if you know a first responder, would you tag them on Facebook right now? Would you tag them? And then what I want you to do is, if you don't know someone or you do know someone, I want you to start looking at the names as they appear, and I just want you to heart it if you would pray for that name this week. And so as you begin to see names kind of appear, if you're going to just do one name per line. Don't put like 16 names in one line, but just put one name and start tagging them. And if you're willing to pray for that person's name, would you just heart it? And then I want you to go ahead and write down that name and just begin your day this week praying for the person that's putting themselves in a posture of serving, willing to go to work every single day. Would you do that? I think it's just huge. I think it's huge because there's something special about walking into the trouble with a clear heart and a clear mind, where maybe our heart races on the inside a bit, but we have this resolve that we're going to still do what God has called us to do. I think that's just remarkable. But I also think it has a lot to do with perspective. And Paul kind of illustrates this perspective here. He actually, you know how like sometimes we will have an explanation, or especially, goodness, I see it with my kids all the time. We're having this conversation and we're drawn into it, and we're having this dialogue back and forth, and we're listening to the answer of why something happened, and then there's a but. I'm like, well, I was gonna da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And then, but, here it is. Or it's this explanation of why things were great, and man, this was so good, and this was fantastic, but we could have, that kind of thing. Paul has a number of buts here in this passage we're going to go through. But if you'll notice, his but's different than our butt. You see what I'm saying? His butt is different than our butts that we use in our sentences. You feel me? You picking up what I'm putting down? Here it comes. He says, this is Paul talking, we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Usually we save the bad piece for us on the backside of the butt. Like we start with the good and then we end with the bad. So Paul says, hey, here's the deal. We are pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We are perplexed, but we're not in despair. We are persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. And so when we read that in the passage, and we'll hold that up there for a couple of minutes so you can just kind of read and think through it. When we read that, I just get this picture that there's a smile on his face. Because honestly, when we look at both, we're like, I don't really like either sides of that butt. You know what I'm saying? But Paul is trying to say, hey, from the mentality of being someone who follows Jesus, knowing that I don't have to manufacture the hope, that's not my responsibility. I have to put myself in a place to serve other people in that moment. That's all he's worried about. He said, hey, let me give you some perspective. We are pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. Come on. We're not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we're not abandoned. Amen? We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. That's a good place to be. That is a good place to be. Maybe we need to flip how we use our butts. Maybe we need to make sure that our perspective is in the right place. Maybe we need to take a few moments and figure out, how are we ordering our life? How are we putting ourselves forward? How are we communicating and making sure there's a smile there? And we recognize, you know what? Maybe we could reframe our language just a bit. Did you notice the power of perspective? where does this come from? Where does this perspective come from? Supernaturally, where does it come from? He gives us the answer in 2 Corinthians 4, 10 and 12. He just continues. He says, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be also revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Right? Did you pick that up? He said, hey, here's the deal. Every single day as a follower of Jesus, nonstop, everywhere we go, the entire time, if we're going to follow Jesus, then we put ourselves in a place where we say, we carry around the death of Jesus with us everywhere we go. Everywhere. That there's never a moment when we don't have it with us. That's just part of being a follower of Jesus. He said there's never a moment when you walk around carrying the death of Jesus. And that at the very same time, as we carry the death of Jesus, our death it's working in us as well. But, he says, life is at work in you too. That while death surrounds us, death begins to shake us, the world begins to shake, all of those things, in those moments, he says, hey, let me be honest with you. Death can do what it does because life is working overtime in you. Jesus is working overtime in you. We see the death of Jesus as we look on the cross. We recognize that he gave everything he had for us. Everything. And we carry that around with us. This is probably one of our greatest reminders as followers of Jesus, that we are simply people of the cross. We are and always will be people of the cross. We can't escape it. If we had gone back to that Friday night and my family goes to see Star Wars, the world didn't feel the same on that evening as it does today. And if you had asked me that evening as we were sitting in our recliner seats at the Regal in Noonan, hey, are you people of the cross? I would have said, of course we're people of the cross. But when you ask me today, hey, are you people of the cross? It just feels a little bit different. It carries a little bit more weight. And I think it's a good thing. I honestly think it's a good thing. Because I believe that it is through our hardships that people will most easily see Jesus. It's through our hardships that people will most easily see Jesus. And I think that holds so much truth. Last week, as things started to unfold, I had a guy who asked me, we planted a foundation in January 2018. We started weekly gatherings. We started working on the project here in the community in February 2017. And so there's 11 months pre-launch here in the community, and then we launch weekly gatherings there in January 2018. And so we're a young church. We're just a little over 2 years old, right? And in that, being a little over 2 years old, we're in a place where, we're just kind of asking, what does it mean for us and what's next for us? And how's this going to work in our world? And so I was having a couple meetings last week, and a guy asked us, hey, with you being a really young church, do you think your church can survive this? It's a good question. My response was incredibly candid. I said, well, We'll find out if we've planted a church or a Sunday brunch club. And we'll find out pretty quick. You know, for us, as we allow that to resonate, it reminds me of a couple things. The first thing is that Sunday brunch clubs, they get pissed off at poor service and cold food. Churches, however, don't have time to worry about the temperature of the food or the service because they're the ones on their hands and knees washing people's feet. They don't have time to complain about those things. People who follow Jesus don't have time to sit around and say, oh goodness, what's going to happen? They are engaged with their world in a way that says, hey, I don't have to create hope for you. I don't have to manufacture it. God has set it inside of me. He said, let there be light inside of me, and now it's there. And in this moment, I just want to simply express that. How do you express that? By serving. We're not on the hook for the content. God is. We're on the hook for the obedience and the posture of serving one another. And it's in this moment we find out, are we just a bunch of brunch buddies? I think it's a question every single one of us should ask. Because the truth is right now that the world is shaking. And as this progresses over the next week or two, I believe the world will begin to shake even more. We don't do really well with change, especially drastic change. And in this moment, we need to make sure that we position ourselves as followers of Jesus to say, hey, we didn't make the hope, but we sure do have enough to go around. And how do we give it to people? We put ourselves in a posture to serve. You see, at the end of the day, we must serve while the world shakes, and the world will see Jesus. Serve while the world shakes, and the world will see Jesus. And so the question becomes, how do I serve from where I am? Right? That's what you're asking. You're like, all right, cool. So you're going to give us this thing to sign up for, and we're going to go serve this week, like all together. No, that's not. I don't have anything for you to. I don't have a thing for you to sign up for. I don't have a moment for you to engage. I don't have that for you. There's not a need for 300 or 400 people to gather together and do this thing, right? That there isn't. The question as we figure out what does church look like as we continue to move forward, it's your house. Where are you right now? Look around at the people that surround you and ask the question, how can I serve you? Maybe it's the person to your right or to your left on the house beside you. I'm not sure. The question becomes, how can you serve them? Every single one of us will be doing one of the two. We'll be serving or we'll be shaking. One of the two. Serve. Serve. Don't put the hope that has a place of residence inside of you to waste. Serve. Serve. You see, if you require a program every time you want to serve, that might be your clue that you've become just a brunch buddy. But if you have the ability to say, God, what would you have me do? What is it you're calling me to in this moment? And the ability to sit and listen and just be quiet and allow God to whisper to you, this is how I want you to spread hope. And then be obedient to that, then we really are becoming the church. It will be different for every single one of you. Serve. Don't shake. Serve. Don't shake.